She doesn't belong here, look at her. Someone call her a cab. Trent Maddox said it loud enough for the entire training ground to hear. 40 men laughed, instructors looked away, and Avery Callahan stood completely still, gray shirt, no rank, no expression, and let every single one of them believe she was helpless. That was her first weapon. They laughed at her size. They sabotaged her gear. They cornered her in a locked building, with a camera running, certain she would break. She warned them once. They didn't listen. What happened next took 19 seconds and ended 3 careers, exposed a cover-up that killed a sailor, and proved that the most dangerous person in that facility had been standing quietly in their blind spot the entire time. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning that changed everything at the Coronado Naval Training Annex began the way most dangerous mornings do, quietly, without warning, and with nobody paying close enough attention. It was 5:40 in the morning. The California air had that particular kind of cold that gets into your bones before the sun has any chance to argue with it. The kind of cold that makes even experienced men hesitate before stepping outside. 40 candidates stood in formation on the main training ground, breath coming out in small white clouds, boots planted on pavement that had not yet warmed from the night before. And then she walked in, no announcement, no escort. No rank visible on her plain gray training shirt. She wore black cargo pants, standard issue boots, and a temporary civilian badge clipped to her collar. She carried a single bag over her left shoulder. She did not look around the way visitors usually do, with that wide-eyed curiosity that announces itself immediately. She looked at the training ground the way someone looks at a place they have already studied from a distance. Systematic, deliberate, like she was confirming what she already knew rather than discovering something new. Avery Callahan took her place in line beside 40 men who had collectively logged thousands of hours of military training, combat deployments, and specialized certifications. And not one of them took her seriously, not at first. Senior Chief Noah Bennett watched her from across the yard. 24 years in the Navy had given him a particular kind of vision, the ability to look at a person and read the information their body was giving away, whether they intended to or not. The way someone stands, the way they breathe, the way their eyes move across a room. He had trained hundreds of men to manage those signals, and he had learned to read them in other people. He watched Avery Callahan take her position in line. Something about her was wrong. Not wrong in the way that danger is wrong. Wrong in the way that a detail is wrong when it does not match the story being told around it. She was supposed to be a civilian performance analyst. Someone from the Department of Defense, sent to observe readiness exercises and compile data. She was standing at parade rest, not the self-conscious, approximate version that civilians sometimes adopt when they are trying to look respectful. The real thing, weight distributed correctly, hands clasped behind the back at the precise location, eyes forward, completely still in a way that the body only learns after someone has demanded it hundreds of times under conditions that made stillness feel impossible. Bennett told himself he was imagining things and went back to his clipboard. He would spend the next several days wishing he had trusted that first instinct. The men around Avery had already begun to form opinions. That is how it works in environments like that one. You arrive, and within minutes, the people around you have already decided who you are and what you are worth. The stories they tell themselves about you become the lens through which they interpret everything you do afterward. Change their mind once and they recalibrate. Change it twice and they get defensive. Change it 3 times and they start looking for reasons to explain away what they are seeing rather than accept that they were wrong. Trent Maddox had already decided. He was 26 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and built like someone who had spent his entire adult life making his body into a statement. He had wrestled in college at a level that earned him genuine respect, and he wore that past accomplishment the way some men wear jewelry constantly visible, referenced often, used to establish position in every new room he entered. He was not stupid. That was the important thing to understand about Trent. Stupid bullies are predictable and manageable. Trent was intelligent enough to choose his targets carefully, smart enough to know which behavior the people above him would overlook, and disciplined enough to maintain a performance record that made him genuinely valuable to Commander Mercer. That combination, real ability wrapped around a rotten core, made him dangerous in ways that went beyond the physical. He looked at Avery standing in line and made his assessment in approximately 4 seconds. "Who called the office?" he said, not quietly, to the 2 men closest to him. Blake Rourke laughed. He was the kind of man who was always slightly too loud, as though he learned early that volume could substitute for substance. He had a wide build, a red face that went redder when he was excited, and a habit of moving through spaces as though other people's physical comfort was not a factor he needed to consider. His role in the group was amplification. Whatever Trent said, Blake made louder. Whatever Trent started, Blake escalated. "She's probably here to watch us," Blake said. "Take some notes. Go back and tell the brass how impressive we are." Cody Vance was quieter than the other two, which people often mistook for thoughtfulness. He was a gifted marksman, genuinely exceptional, the kind of natural ability that instructors mention in the same breath as candidates who went on to distinguished careers. But Cody's particular cruelty was more precise than Blake's and more patient than Trent's. He liked to find the specific thing that would cause the most damage and apply it at the moment of maximum effect. Where Trent used blunt force and Blake used noise, Cody used a scalpel. He looked at Avery and said nothing yet. He was waiting to learn more before he chose his angle. The first exercise that morning was the obstacle course. It was not the most technically demanding element of the training program, but it was the one that revealed the most about how a person moves under physical stress, whether they conserve energy or burn it recklessly, whether they problem solve in motion or lock up when a transition does not go as expected, whether they compete against the course or against the other people running it. Avery ran it in silence. She did not announce herself. She did not make any visible effort to demonstrate anything. She simply ran it the way she had clearly been trained to run it efficiently, without wasted energy, adapting to each obstacle with movements that were practiced enough to look unremarkable. She looked closely and realized that everything she was doing was exactly right. She finished 47 seconds ahead of Trent Maddox, who had the second best time in the group. The yard went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Trent stood at the finish line breathing hard, and for exactly 2 seconds, his face showed something unguarded, something that was almost confusion. Then it closed back down and became something else. "They shortened it for her," he said. He said it casually. "The way you say something you know is not true, but want to establish as a possible explanation before the true explanation has time to take root. Look at the Eastern Run. The distance on the Eastern Run was not the same." Blake nodded immediately. "I noticed that too. The markers were different. They had not been." Senior Chief Bennett watched the entire course. The markers had not moved. The distance had not changed. He wrote something on his clipboard and said nothing. Avery did not argue. She walked to the water station, drank, checked her left boot, where the lace had partially loosened on the final descent, retied it with 3 efficient movements, and stood ready for the next exercise. That afternoon they moved to the range. Cody Vance was in his element there. He moved through the shooting portion of the program with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been good at something for so long that the act itself has become an extension of personality. He grouped his shots with a consistency that was genuinely impressive, and he knew it, and he let that knowledge sit visibly in his posture. When Avery stepped to the line, he positioned himself just close enough to watch without appearing to watch. He had decided this was the moment he would learn who she actually was. Shooting could be faked in some parts of the evaluation process. The range, at this distance, with these conditions, was harder to fake. She fired 5 rounds. Cody walked to the target after scoring was called. He stood there for a moment. The 5 holes were inside a 2-inch group, at 500 yards, under wind conditions that had already cost 2 experienced candidates several points. He walked back without saying anything. Then, after a pause long enough to feel deliberate, he said, "Modified rifle." He said it to Blake, not to Avery. That was the technique denies someone the dignity of a direct accusation. Say it sideways so it spreads like a rumor, rather than sitting in front of her as a challenge she can answer. "Has to be," Blake agreed. "They probably set her up with something enhanced. Make the numbers look better." Avery heard every word. She turned and looked at Cody with an expression that was completely flat. Not angry, not hurt, not defensive, just observing. Like she was recording the moment for reference, rather than reacting to it. "The rifle's right there," she said. "You can inspect it." Cody smiled in that specific way that means the words coming next are designed to sting. "I'm sure it would pass inspection now." Avery held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to her lane and began the cleanup procedure for her station. Cody watched her and felt something he did not quite have a name for. It was not respect. He was not ready to call it that. It was closer to the feeling of pulling a thread and having it not give the way you expected. Like the resistance was coming from somewhere unexpected. He filed it away and said nothing more about it. The harness incident happened on the second morning. They were preparing for a vertical climbing exercise, equipment laid out on the ground for self-inspection before use. Avery knelt beside her harness for exactly the amount of time a thorough inspection requires, not less, not more, and then stood up and set it aside. Problem? The equipment coordinator asked. Hairline fracture on the load-bearing buckle, Avery said. She said the serial number of the harness from memory, without looking at the tag. Third one from the left, number 774-Echo. It should not be in rotation. The coordinator looked at the harness, looked at the buckle, looked at her. I'll have it checked, he said. 3 minutes later, Trent walked past her with his climbing harness already on. Real operators don't panic over a loose strap, he said. He said it loudly enough for the group to hear. Several people smiled. 2 hours later, the inspection team pulled 4 harnesses from rotation. One of them was 774-Echo. The buckle, under magnification, showed a fracture that a standard visual inspection would almost certainly have missed. Nobody apologized, but Senior Chief Bennett made a note. Then he made another note. He had now seen her remember serial numbers, identify a structural defect with the naked eye, and complete an obstacle course faster than his best candidates under identical conditions. He had also watched her absorb 3 days of contempt from Trent Maddox, Blake Rourke, and Cody Vance without visibly reacting, without complaint, without seeking any kind of intervention or acknowledgement from the instructors. That restraint in his experience only came from one of 2 places. Either someone was genuinely frightened and had shut down, or someone was disciplined enough to understand that showing your hand too early costs you the advantage. Avery Callahan did not look frightened. Bennett attempted to access her personnel file that evening. He had clearance for most standard documentation connected to the annex. He entered her name and badge number and waited. 3/4 of the file was classified. The sections available to him said she held a doctorate in organizational performance assessment, had been employed by 3 separate government agencies over the past decade, and had received the Department of Defense Distinguished Service Medal at 31 years old. The sections he could not read were marked with classification codes he had only encountered twice before in his career, both times in connection with individuals whose operational backgrounds were not discussed in ordinary administrative channels. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling fan for a moment. Then he thought about the way she checked doorways. Up every room she entered, her eyes went to the exits first, not nervously, automatically. The way it becomes automatic only after someone has spent significant time in environments where knowing your exits is the difference between going home and not going home. He thought about the way she never sat with her back to an open door. He thought about the serial number she had recited from memory. He thought about the 5 rounds inside 2 inches at 500 yards. He told himself he would approach her in the morning, ask a direct question, see what she said. What happened instead was the incident on the 3rd afternoon. It was a combat movement, drill-controlled contact scenarios in pairs, designed to evaluate how candidates respond to unexpected physical confrontations under time pressure. It was a legitimate exercise, properly supervised with safety protocols in place. Trent Maddox was paired with a candidate across the yard from Avery's group. The drill was running on a signal. You moved when the whistle blew and stopped when it blew again. Standard choreography. When the signal came, Trent moved, and he moved toward Avery's lane instead of his own designated path. The collision happened hard, shoulder to shoulder, his weight and momentum versus hers. She staggered sideways but did not fall. "My bad," Trent said with a smile that said the opposite. Blake immediately said, loud enough for the surrounding candidates to hear clearly, "You all right there?" Sometimes the big kids in this exercise can be a lot to handle. Cody walked past a moment later and looked at Avery's shoulder where the collision had landed. "You probably want to have that looked at," he said pleasantly. "The medical staff is very good at helping people recognize when a program might be too physically demanding for their particular situation." He was not asking if she was hurt. He was suggesting she leave. Avery looked at the 3 of them in turn. She said nothing. Her expression did not change. She adjusted her position, checked that her gear had stayed secured during the collision, and prepared for the next signal. From across the yard, Bennett watched Trent's face as Avery turned away. He saw the flicker of something, irritation, maybe, or the specific frustration of someone who threw something and watched it bounce off without leaving a mark. That frustration, Bennett knew from experience, was the thing that made people escalate. And he was right to be concerned about it, because something else was happening that Bennett could not yet see. Something beneath the surface of the daily exercises, underneath the scores and the certifications and the harassment and the small cruelties of 3 men who had never been told no in a way that actually stuck. Avery was working. Every evening when the candidates broke for quarters, Avery moved through a different part of the annex. Not obviously, not in ways that attracted attention. She had an access authorization that allowed her to be in administrative and support spaces during off hours for the purpose of day collection. It was a legitimate authorization. Commander Mercer had signed it himself because he had been told she was compiling readiness metrics for a DoD efficiency review. He had not asked many questions about the specifics. That was a mistake he would spend a long time regretting. In the maintenance records she was reviewing, Avery found the first discrepancy on the second evening. It was small, the kind of small that is either a data entry error or the edge of something much larger. A diving regulator unit identification number recorded in the maintenance log had been marked as past inspection on a Tuesday. The certification signature belonged to a petty officer who, according to separate personnel records, had been on emergency family leave that entire week. He had not been at the annex. He could not have signed the inspection record, but his signature was there. Avery photographed the page with the small device she carried in her left cargo pocket, the one that looked like a compact tactical flashlight and was not, and moved carefully to the next section of records. She found 3 more discrepancies before the hour was over. She found 11 more over the following 2 evenings. By the end of her 4th day at the annex, she had a documented pattern of falsified inspection signatures, equipment returned to service without legitimate certification, and qualification scores that showed suspicious upward adjustments clustered around candidates with particular family and financial connections to Commander Mercer and 2 private defense contractors. The pattern was clear, the scope was serious, and it had been happening long enough that the people responsible had stopped being careful about it because nobody had ever looked closely enough to find it. Nobody had ever sent someone who could find it. On the 4th evening, Avery sat in the small room she had been assigned and looked at the evidence she had compiled, organized in her memory and in the encrypted drive that looked like a standard thumb drive and was not. She thought about Daniel Foster, 23 years old, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, youngest of 3 siblings, the only one to join the military. His sister Lauren had described him in the initial briefing as someone who had always believed in doing things the right way, even when it cost him. Even when it would have been easier to look away. He had seen damaged equipment being returned to service. He had seen scores being changed. He had seen candidates with influential connections being protected from consequences that ordinary candidates faced without question. And he had not looked away. He had written to his sister instead. Something is wrong here. 4 words that cost him everything and proved every single thing Avery had found in those maintenance records. She thought about the message for a long time that night. She thought about the men who had laughed at her for 4 days, about Trent's deliberate shoulder check, about Blake's endless amplified contempt, about Cody's precise cruelties deployed at moments chosen for maximum damage. She thought about all of that, and she thought about a 23-year-old man who went into dark water one night and did not come back up, and whose death had been written off as personal error by the same people responsible for the system that killed him. And she sat very still in her room, the way she had learned to sit still in places where showing what you knew too early was the fastest way to lose everything you had worked to build. She was not afraid of Trent Maddox. She had never been afraid of Trent Maddox. She was afraid of this, that she would find the evidence, and that someone would find a way to make it disappear before it could matter, before it could change anything. Before Daniel Foster's death could mean something more than a classified footnote in an administrative record that nobody would ever be allowed to read. That was the fear that kept her disciplined. That was the fear that kept her silent when silence cost her something. That was the fear that made her absorb 4 days of contempt from 3 men who believed she was helpless because the mission was not about them. The mission had never been about them until the evening of the 5th day when it became about them in a way that nobody had anticipated. Bennett found her near the equipment storage building after the evening meal. He had clearly been deciding whether to have this conversation for several days and had finally decided that not having it was more dangerous than having it. "Walk with me," he said. They moved away from the main buildings, toward the outer perimeter of the training ground, where the ambient noise of the annex created enough cover for a private conversation. "You knew that harness was defective before the inspection team found it," Bennett said. He was not asking. "You called the serial number from memory. You've been remembering everything here, times, numbers, conversations, without writing down a single thing I've seen. You move like someone who's done this before. Not office work. The other kind." Avery looked at him steadily. She was measuring him. He could feel it. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm exactly what my badge says I am," she said. "Your badge says you're a civilian performance analyst. Then that answers your question." Bennett stopped walking. He turned to face her directly. "A sailor died here 8 months ago. Daniel Foster. He went into the water during a night exercise and he didn't come back up. The official report says he made errors. Equipment failure attributed to personal negligence. Case closed. Avery said nothing. I wrote a report after his death, Bennett said. I documented concerns about the equipment inspection process. I documented the fact that his regulator had shown prior signs of malfunction. My report was reviewed by Commander Mercer. He paused, and then it disappeared. Silence. Did Daniel Foster deserve to die? Avery asked. The question landed in the space between them like something physical. Bennett looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face moved the precise kind of movement that happens when a person who has been holding something heavy for a very long time is finally offered a place to set it down. No, he said. He did not mean. It was not a request exactly. It was not a command. It was something in between an invitation offered to someone she had decided could be trusted, extended at exactly the moment she calculated the risk was worth accepting. Bennett held her gaze. What do you need? He said. The archived maintenance logs, she said, the originals. The ones from the 90 days before Daniel Foster's death. Those are restricted, I know. Can you access them? A pause. Yes, he said. Then that's what I need. They walked back toward the main building in silence. The annex was settling into evening quiet around them, lights going off in the barracks, the distant sound of equipment being secured for the night, the particular stillness of a military installation in the hours between last formation and the next morning. Neither of them said anything more. Neither of them needed to. What they did not know, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that 40 meters away, partly obscured by the side of a supply building, Trent Maddox had stopped walking the moment he saw them together. He had not heard the words. He was not close enough for that. But he had seen the expression on Bennett's face, and he had seen something in the way Avery Callahan carried herself in that moment, something that was different from the way she moved during training exercises. Less contained, more purposeful, like someone who had just taken an important step forward in a plan that had been running much longer than anyone around her realized. Trent watched them disappear into the building, and something cold moved through him. Not quite fear, not yet. Something that was the precursor to fear, the moment when the story you have been telling yourself about a situation starts showing cracks and you have not yet decided whether to admit it or shore up the cracks with something louder. He pulled out his phone and typed a message. He sent it to Blake, then to Cody, then after a moment's hesitation, to a number he rarely used, one that connected him to Commander Mercer's personal aide. The message said simply, "We need to talk tonight." In her room, Avery sat down and began planning for what she already suspected was coming. She had been in enough situations to recognize the specific feeling of a mission entering its most dangerous phase. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was simply the moment when the people who had something to lose began to understand that they had something to lose and started making the particular kinds of decisions that frightened, cornered people make when they believe their only option is to act before it is too late. She thought about Daniel Foster. She thought about the water and the dark and the moment when a 23-year-old man had sent a distress signal and waited for someone to come, and someone had seen it and chosen not to. She sat with that thought until it stopped feeling like information and started feeling like obligation. Then she checked the door, confirmed her position, and began to wait. Bennett's office was small and smelled like old coffee and printer paper. He kept it that way deliberately, nothing in it that looked like it mattered. So nobody ever looked too closely at what was actually happening there. He unlocked the archive terminal at 9:47 that evening, and Avery stood behind his left shoulder while the system loaded. Neither of them spoke while the files populated the screen. The maintenance logs for the 90 days prior to Daniel Foster's death filled 6 digital folders. Standard formatting. Standard headers. The kind of documentation that looks thorough until you know what you are looking for, and then it looks like a building, with a wall missing functional from the front, hollow from the right angle. Here, Avery said, and pointed at the screen without touching it. Bennett leaned in. The entry was dated 11 days before Daniel's death. A diving regulator unit number R441 Foxtrot had been flagged during routine inspection for seal degradation and pressure inconsistency. The flagging notation was there, clearly entered, time-stamped at 1422 by a petty officer named Garza. The clearance notation, the one that said the equipment had been repaired and recertified, was time-stamped 4 hours later. Same day, the signature belonged to Garza as well. Is that fast? Though she already knew the answer. For a seal replacement and full pressure recertification, Bennett said. You're looking at a minimum of 18 hours. The parts alone take time to source. 4 hours is impossible. Pull Garza's access log for that day, Avery said. Bennett's fingers moved over the keyboard. He pulled the security access record, the digital trail of every door Garza had badged through that day. Garza had not badged into the equipment maintenance facility at all that afternoon. He had been in the administrative building from 1300 to 1700, attending a mandatory records compliance briefing. Sign-in sheet confirmed. 40 people in the room. He could not have performed the recertification. He could not have been in two places at once. But his signature said he had. Someone used his credentials, Avery said. Someone with system access, Bennett said. His voice had gone very quiet. That's not a junior mistake. That's not someone cutting a corner because they were lazy. That's a deliberate falsification using stolen authentication. Avery straightened up. Pull R441 Foxtrot's full service history. Bennett pulled it. The regulator appeared in the record as having passed 3 consecutive inspections over the prior 6 months. All 3 certifications showed anomalies. When you looked at the cross-referenced access logs timestamps that did not align with the certifying technician's documented location or signatures from personnel who had been on leave. R441 Foxtrot had never legitimately passed inspection. It had been rotated back into service 6 times over 14 months using falsified records. The room was completely silent for a moment. Then Bennett said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "That was the unit assigned to Daniel Foster on the night he died." Avery felt something settle in her chest, not surprise. The investigation had been pointing here for days. But there is a difference between the shape of a conclusion and the weight of it when it fully arrives. The weight of this one was considerable. "Is there a way to pull the original equipment assignment log for that exercise?" she asked. The original, yes. The official submitted version, yes. Should be the same document. He pulled both. They were not the same document. The original timestamped the evening of the exercise. Before it began showed R441 Foxtrot assigned to candidate Foster D, with a notation beside it in a different hand, "Flag for replacement seal integrity questionable." Someone had seen the problem. Someone had written it down. The official submitted version, timestamped 3 days after Daniel Foster's death, during the administrative review period, showed R441 Foxtrot with a clean certification key and no flag. The handwritten concern had been removed. The digital record had been altered. And the timestamp on the alteration, if you knew where to look for it in the file metadata, pointed to a terminal in Commander Mercer's administrative suite. Avery said, "I need you to make a secure copy of both versions. The metadata included." "I can do that," Bennett said. He was already moving. His hands were steady, but his jaw was set in the particular way that happens when a person is managing something large by keeping their attention entirely on the immediate task in front of them. He initiated the secure copy transfer. The progress bar moved across the screen. And then at 63%, the screen went black. Not a power failure. The terminal status lights were still on. The rest of the system was still running. This was targeted. Selective. Something had remotely terminated the archive session and simultaneously wiped the active transfer. Bennett stared at the screen. "Someone is monitoring the archive access," Avery said. "In real time," Bennett said, "which means they know we were in there." Neither of them stated the obvious conclusion, because stating it would have taken time they did not have. If someone was monitoring archive access in real time and had the capability to remotely terminate a session and wipe an active transfer, that someone had significant system authority. That someone was not a petty officer covering for a lazy afternoon. That someone was operating with the kind of access that came from rank, or from someone with rank who was willing to use it. "How much did you get?" Avery asked. Bennett checked the local buffer. Partial file. About 60% of both documents. The metadata fragment is there, but it's incomplete. It might be enough to establish the alteration. It might not. Send what you have to the secondary address I gave you. Now? Right now. Bennett sent it. Avery watched the confirmation appear and felt the tightness in her chest ease by exactly 1 degree. Not enough, but something. Something was outside the walls of this terminal now, in a place that whoever had just killed the archive session could not reach. She thought about Daniel Foster and about the flag notation someone had written in the original log, and about the fact that someone had seen the problem with that regulator and written it down, and then someone else had erased it. And then a 23-year-old man had gone into dark water with a regulator that had never legitimately passed inspection. "Go back to your quarters through the East Corridor," she told Bennett. "Don't go back through admin. Don't make any calls from your office phone tonight." "Are you telling me I'm being monitored?" "I'm telling you to act as if you are." Bennett looked at her. In the dim light of the office, With the blank screen behind him and the weight of what they had just found sitting between them, he looked older than he had that morning. Not weaker, just older in the specific way that happens when you see the full shape of something you had previously only half understood. I should have pushed harder after Daniel died, he said. You pushed, Avery said. They pushed back harder. That's the part we're going to fix. She left through the side door. She did not know that Trent Maddox had been outside for the last 20 minutes. He had positioned himself in the narrow space between the supply building and the outer fence, close enough to watch the exit from Bennett's office, far enough to be invisible unless someone was specifically looking for him. He had not heard the conversation. He had not seen the screen. But he had watched the light in Bennett's office go out suddenly, and he had watched Avery come out of the side door, moving with the specific kind of controlled urgency that does not look urgent to a casual observer, but reads immediately to someone who knows what focused movement looks like. She was not frightened. She was not retreating. She was executing. Trent pulled out his phone and typed a single word to Blake and Cody. Tomorrow. They knew what it meant. They had discussed it the night before, after Trent's initial message. The plan had been loose then, conditional, something they might need if things escalated. Now Trent had decided things had escalated. He told himself it was a simple solution. Frighten her. Get her badge and her phone. Get whatever she had recorded and delete it. Force her to admit she had no real authority here, and then watch her leave because she would have no choice. He told himself it was clean. He was wrong about that in ways he could not yet see. The following morning, the training day began with a water resistance drill candidates in the main pool, timed underwater transit exercises. The kind of thing that reads as routine physical training and is actually a carefully calibrated assessment of how a person behaves when their body is under oxygen stress and their mind is trying to tell them to surface. Avery moved through it without difficulty. Trent watched her from the pool deck between his own sets, and the thing he had felt the previous evening, that cold precursor to fear, was sharper now, more defined. He had watched her long enough to understand something that he did not want to understand. She was not pretending. None of it had been pretending. The obstacle course, the range, the harness. Every moment of quiet, self-contained competence over the past 5 days. She had not been holding back to avoid attention. She had been holding back because she did not need to prove anything, because she had never been there to prove anything, and the specific thing she was actually there to do was running on a timeline that had nothing to do with what Trent Maddox thought about her. That understanding made him more dangerous, not less. Cody pulled himself out of the pool and toweled off beside Trent. He spoke without looking at him. Blake got a message this morning. She requested a follow-up access to the archived maintenance records. Through official channels, Bennett countersigned the request. Trent was quiet for a moment. When this afternoon? 1400. Then it has to be this morning. Cody dried his hands carefully. She's going to know it's us. She already knows it's us, Trent said. That's the point. She knows, and she thinks she has time to do something about it. We're going to show her she doesn't. Cody looked at him sideways. Trent, I've been watching her for 5 days. So have I. I don't think this ends the way you're picturing it. She's one person, Trent said. We're not. And after tomorrow, she'll have nothing, no badge, no phone, no credibility. Mercer will back us. He always backs us. Cody said nothing else. He pulled his shirt on and walked away. Blake was easier. Blake was always easier. He confirmed the plan with the enthusiasm of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that a plan of his might fail. And he offered to bring the camera, his personal recording device, which he used to film training footage to document what he was already framing as Avery's embarrassing confrontation and retreat. Proof, he said, in case she tries to say we threatened her or something. We'll have everything on camera. Trent nodded. He did not point out that having everything on camera worked in both directions. At 11:15 that morning, an instructor pulled Avery aside to deliver a message. It looked like a routine administrative note, the kind that got passed by hand on the training ground, because digital communication in certain areas of the annex was intentionally restricted. The message said that Senior Chief Bennett needed to see her at the equipment storage building, secondary wing, at 11:45. Unofficial meeting. Leave her access badge at the main desk. Avery read the note twice. Then she looked up at the instructor who had delivered it. Did he give you this in person? Aide handed it off at the briefing room door, the instructor said. Bennett's aide was a petty officer named Castillo. Avery had spoken with Castillo twice. She had noticed that Castillo communicated with Bennett exclusively through the secure internal messaging system, never by handwritten note. Bennett had mentioned it himself as a standing protocol after a miscommunication 2 years prior. Bennett had not sent this note. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the deleted archive, about the remote terminal shutdown, about whoever had been monitoring system access in real time. She thought about Trent Maddox standing 40 meters away the previous evening, and she made a decision. She could report the note immediately. She could document it, escalate it to Special Agent Shaw through the secure channel, and let the process handle what was clearly an attempt to isolate her. That was the safe choice, the procedurally correct choice. Or she could go to the equipment storage building at 11:45 and let whatever was going to happen happen. Because whatever happened would be documented by her personal device, and whatever was said would be admissible. And if Trent and Blake and Cody made the decision to threaten a federal investigator inside a naval facility, then they would be handing her something that no amount of falsified records or administrative cover could make disappear. She had building a case around documents and logs and metadata. Sometimes the case walked up and introduced itself. She sent a single encrypted message to Shaw. It contained her location, the time of the meeting, and 4 words: keep the channel open. Then she went to the equipment storage building. The secondary wing was quieter than the main facility, older equipment, less frequent traffic, the kind of space that fills up during exercises and empties out between them. At 11:43, Avery pushed through the side door and let her eyes adjust. They were already there, all 3 of them, Trent near the far wall, Blake at the main door, which he had let swing closed behind her, Cody to her right, arms crossed, watching her with that specific expression of his careful, precise waiting. Blake held up the camera. "Nice of you to show up," Trent said. Avery looked at the camera. She looked at the door. She looked at Trent. Her expression did not change at all. "Where's Bennett?" she said. "Not coming," Trent said. He pushed off the wall and took 3 steps toward her. "But that's fine. We don't need him for this conversation. This conversation is just between us." "What conversation is that?" "The one where you give me your badge and your phone," Trent said. "And the one where you admit to the people who need to hear it that you exaggerated your role here, misrepresented your authority, and have been manufacturing concerns about equipment and records that don't exist. And then you get in your car and you drive away from this facility and nobody ever sees you again." He said it calmly, organizationally, like a man accustomed to being obeyed. Avery looked at him for a long moment. "You sent a false message using Bennett's identity to get me here," she said. "I don't know what you're talking about. You've been monitoring archive access. You remotely terminated a secure file transfer last night." Trent's jaw tightened slightly. "You're confused. You've been falsifying equipment inspection records for at least 14 months. You've been doing it with Commander Mercer's knowledge and the cooperation of at least 2 personnel with system authentication access. And you know about Daniel Foster's regulator." The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. Nothing in the physical space shifted. But the quality of the silence shifted from the silence of 3 men who believed they were in control of a situation to the silence of 3 men who had just heard something said out loud that they had believed was safely contained inside a set of deleted files. Blake lowered the camera slightly. He did not stop recording. Cody uncrossed his arms. Trent's expression went through 3 changes in rapid succession. Surprise, then the rapid suppression of surprise, then something harder and colder that came up to replace it. "Step away from the door," Avery said. She said it to Blake, but she was watching Trent. Nobody moved. "Cody saw a distress signal during Daniel Foster's night exercise," Avery said. He told Trent. And Trent made a decision about how long to wait before reporting it. "I know this because the timeline in the original exercise report does not match the timeline in the submitted incident record. And the gap between them is long enough to matter, and there is only one reason to change that timeline after the fact." Cody's face did something complicated. His eyes moved to Trent for exactly half a second. "It was enough." "That's a lie," Trent said. His voice had changed. The organizational calm was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something had cracked. "You switched his regulator," Avery said. "You wanted him to struggle enough to withdraw his complaint. You didn't plan for it to go the way it went, but when it did go that way, you made a second decision. And Commander Mercer made sure that decision stayed buried." Trent moved. He reached for her shoulder, the same grab he had used on the training ground 3 days earlier. Hard, deliberate, certain of its effect. Avery warned them one final time. "Step away from the door." Trent's hand closed on her shoulder. What happened next took less than 20 seconds and ended the careers of 3 men who had spent years believing that their physical strength was the final word in any argument. She trapped his wrist before the grip could fully set her left hand, rotating under and around his forearm in a motion that used his own closing force against the joint. He had approximately half a second to register that the arm he had reached with was now in a position his shoulder did not want it to be in. And then she was already moving under his arm, turning into him, using his forward momentum to redirect his considerable mass toward the floor in a controlled, precise arc. He hit the ground hard, but without the kind of impact that breaks things. She had not tried to hurt him. She had tried to stop him, and she had stopped him, and the stopping had been absolute. Blake came from the side without thinking, the kind of reactive charge that is all muscle and no strategy. She moved laterally, let him miss by 8 inches, got her right hip inside his center of gravity, and swept his lead leg out from under him with a low, fast kick that dropped him sideways onto the equipment crate he had been standing beside. Cody, to his credit, did not charge. He moved behind her and tried to use his reach advantage to pin her arms. He had the right idea and the wrong opponent. She bent forward sharply, breaking his grip at the weakest point of the hold, then reversed into him with her elbow coming back and up. She did not need to finish the movement. His instinct was to protect himself, and protecting himself meant releasing her, and the moment he released her, she had his arm, and then she had his balance, and then she had him against the storage cage with his wrist controlled, and the training knife from his waistband in her other hand. She set the knife on top of the cage. She stepped back. All 3 of them were down. Trent on the floor, processing what had just happened. Blake on his side against the crate, the camera still running in his hand because he had never thought to stop it. Cody against the cage, breathing carefully. Blake's camera had recorded all of it. The threat, the demand, the admission about Daniel Foster's timeline. Cody's half-second look at Trent when Avery named him. All of it. Trent looked up at her from the floor, and for one unguarded moment, the arrogance was completely gone. What replaced it was something rawer and younger, the expression of a man who has just discovered that the world does not work the way he was certain it worked. Then the door opened. Commander Grant Mercer came through it, with 2 armed security personnel at his sides, and behind them, 3 more candidates from the training group who had clearly been brought along to witness. Mercer looked at the scene. He looked at Avery. He looked at his 3 favored candidates on the floor, and he made the decision that defined everything about who he was. "Restrain her," he said. "She assaulted 3 naval candidates and is operating in this facility under fraudulent authority." The security personnel moved toward Avery. She put her hands up immediately. She did not resist. She looked at Blake's camera, still recording, still pointed at the space where she stood. Trent got to his feet. He straightened his shirt. He looked at the witnesses Mercer had brought, and the arrogance came flooding back into his face because authority had arrived. And authority was on his side, and that was the natural order of things as he had always known it. "She finally learned," he said, loud enough for the witnesses to hear clearly. "She finally learned what happens when a civilian pretends to be something she isn't." The security officer closest to Avery reached for her wrists. She let him take them. She looked at Blake's camera one more time. She looked at the door. She let the handcuffs close around her wrists and said absolutely nothing. And her face was completely composed. And she stood in the middle of the equipment storage building in handcuffs, while Trent Maddox laughed at her, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. What she was waiting for arrived 41 seconds later. The sound of vehicles came first, multiple, heavy, moving fast across the outer access road. Then the particular quality of silence that falls over a space when the people in it suddenly realize that something has changed in the situation around them, and they do not yet know how. Mercer's expression shifted. He looked at the security personnel. He looked at the door. Then the door opened, and Special Agent Rebecca Shaw walked through it, and behind her came 6 federal investigators in windbreakers. And behind them came a communications officer carrying a receiver that was still live streaming from the channel Avery had left open 41 minutes earlier. Shaw looked at Avery in handcuffs. She looked at Trent, still straightening his shirt. She looked at Mercer. "Release her," she said. Mercer started to speak. "Commander," Shaw said, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been looking forward to this moment for a time and is carefully not showing it. "I am going to need you to stop talking and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The security officer released Avery's wrists. Avery straightened her sleeves. She looked at Trent Maddox, who was no longer laughing. Shaw opened a document case and removed a federal identification card that she held up for the room to see. "Avery Callahan is the lead undercover investigator in a federal inquiry under the authority of the Department of Defense Inspector General," she said. "She has been operating in this facility under authorized cover. Everything that has occurred in this room for the past 47 minutes has been transmitted live to a federal evidence server. The audio and visual record from that camera, she pointed at the device, still in Blake's hand, has already been received and logged. Blake looked down at the camera like he had forgotten it was there. Like he had forgotten it had been recording everything, including him, including all three of them, including the words Trent had said about Daniel Foster's distress signal and the decision he had made. His face went the color of something that has been left out too long. "Commander Mercer," Shaw continued, turning to face him directly, "I have a federal warrant for the seizure of all administrative and maintenance records in this facility. A warrant for the arrest of 3 named individuals, pending a grand jury indictment, and a preliminary arrest order for you, personally related to charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. You are not required to say anything. Anything you say will be used against you. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Mercer said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I want my attorney." "That is your right," Shaw said pleasantly. "Someone will facilitate that." Trent turned to Avery. The arrogance was completely gone now, replaced by something she had seen before in men who had operated without consequence for so long that the arrival of consequence felt not just unfair but physically incomprehensible, like a law of physics had suddenly reversed. "You were never a performance analyst," he said. "No," Avery said. This whole time, he stared at her. "Daniel Foster," she said. "That was his name. 23 years old. He saw what you were doing, and he told the truth about it. That is why I am standing here." Trent said nothing. "He was braver than you," Avery said. "He was braver than all 3 of you, and he had a lot less protection." One of the federal investigators touched Trent's arm. "Come with me, please," Trent went. The room emptied steadily. Investigators, security personnel, candidates who had come to watch Avery Callahan finally get what was coming to her, and were now standing very still and very quiet in the particular silence of people who have just discovered that they entirely misunderstood the situation they were observing. Shaw walked to Avery and spoke quietly. "Bennett's partial file transfer came through. Forensics says the metadata is enough to establish the alteration timestamp and the terminal of origin." "Mercer Suite," Avery said. "Mercer Suite," Shaw confirmed. "We're pulling the full financial record today. The contractor payments, the falsified certifications, all of it." "Cody knows about the night exercise," Avery said. "He was there. He saw the distress signal before Trent decided to delay. He's going to want to protect himself. Then we'll give him the opportunity to do that," Shaw said. Bennett appeared in the doorway. He looked at the empty space where Mercer had been standing, and then he looked at Avery, and his expression held something that was not quite relief, too complicated for that, too weighted with everything that had brought them to this room, but was moving in that direction. "They deleted the archive," he said. "I know," Avery said. He stopped. "I thought it was over when the screen went blank." "It wasn't," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked around the room. He looked at the storage cage where Cody's training knife still sat on top, placed there with the precision of someone who had chosen its location carefully. "Daniel's family," Bennett said. "His sister. Does she?" "She'll know the truth," Avery said. "That's the part we promised her. That's what we're going to deliver." Bennett stood in the doorway for a moment. 24 years. The weight of them was visible in the way he stood. Everything he had seen, everything he had stayed silent about for too long, everything he had finally chosen to do when it mattered. "He wrote to his sister that something was wrong here," Bennett said. "I didn't know he did that until you told me. But I knew something was wrong. I knew it before he died. He stopped again." "You stopped looking away," Avery said. "That's the part that matters now." Outside, the sound of the federal vehicles carrying Mercer and the 3 candidates away faded toward the main gate. The annex was settling into a stunned, quiet 40 candidates. A dozen instructors, support staff, all of them processing the specific disorientation of discovering that the world they thought they had been operating in was not the world that had actually been operating around them. Avery walked to the equipment cage. She picked up the training knife. She set it in the evidence tray one of Shaw's investigators was carrying past. Then she walked to the doorway and stood in the open air and breathed. She thought about Daniel Foster. She thought about his message to his sister, 4 words, sent 2 days before he died, from a man who understood exactly what he was risking and sent the message anyway. Something is wrong here. He had been right. He had been right about all of it. And the system that killed him had been so certain of its own protection that it had not bothered to fully cover its tracks. Because fully covering your tracks requires believing that someone capable of finding them will eventually come looking. Someone had come looking, and now the tracks led all the way to the top. The hardest part was not over. Avery knew that. The evidence was strong but not yet complete. Cody's testimony would matter. The financial records would matter. The grand jury proceeding would be long and contested, and the people with resources would use all of them. But the archive was preserved. Bennett's testimony was secured. Blake's camera had captured everything. And Daniel Foster's original equipment logged the one with the handwritten flag, the one that proved someone had seen the problem and written it down before someone else erased it, existed in the partial transfer that had cleared the system before it was shut down. It was enough. She did not allow herself to feel the relief of that fully yet. There was still too much to do. But she let herself feel the edge of it, the specific sensation of a mission that has crossed the point of no return, where the truth is no longer something only one person knows. And the people who built their safety on silence have discovered that silence has finally run out. Behind her, Bennett was on the phone. His voice was low and controlled, and he was calling the independent inspection team to schedule an emergency equipment review of every piece of diving equipment in the facility. It was the right call. It was the first of many right calls he would make in the weeks ahead. Avery looked at the training ground, empty now in the midday quiet. She thought, Daniel, we found it. We found all of it. She thought, your sister's going to know the truth. She thought, that has to be enough because it is all we have to give her. It was not nothing. In the particular economy of justice, imperfect, delayed, incomplete as justice always is, it was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything that a 23-year-old man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had asked for when he sent 4 words to his sister and trusted that someone would eventually come. The handcuffs came off at 11:53. Avery heard the click of the release and felt the metal leave her wrists, and she did not rub them the way people do in movies, because they had not been on long enough to hurt, and she had not been frightened enough to need the comfort of that gesture. She straightened her sleeves. She looked at Shaw. She looked at the room around her, the investigators moving with practiced efficiency, the security personnel standing down, the 3 candidates who had been brought as witnesses now standing very still against the far wall, with the specific expression of people who have just discovered that the performance they came to watch was not the performance that was actually being staged. Trent Maddox was still standing near the equipment cage. He had not been formally restrained yet. His attorney had not arrived. He was standing in the particular posture of a man whose body has not yet received the message that the situation has fundamentally and irreversibly changed, because the mind is still processing the information and is taking longer than expected. Shaw was speaking to one of her investigators in a low, rapid exchange about the chain of custody for Blake's camera. Blake himself was sitting on the equipment crate he had been dropped against, holding the camera in his lap with both hands, looking at it with the expression of someone contemplating an object that has profoundly betrayed them. Cody stood against the cage exactly where Avery had placed him. He had not moved. His training knife was still on top of the cage where she had set it. He was looking at the floor with the focused attention of a man who needs something to look at that does not require him to look at anyone else. Bennett came in through the side door at 11:58. He had been outside when Shaw's vehicles arrived, and he had watched them come in from the training ground with the expression of a man watching something he had stopped believing would ever arrive. He looked at the scene, and then he looked at Avery, and the thing in his face was complicated and real, and carried the specific weight of 24 years of picking the wrong moments to stay silent. It worked, he said. He said it like a statement, but it sounded like a question he was still waiting for permission to believe. It worked, Avery said. He looked at Mercer, who was standing between 2 investigators, his attorney on the phone somewhere in transit, his face set in the specific rigidity of a man who has decided that his only remaining available performance is dignity. Commander Grant Mercer, 26 years of service, the architect of a system that had consumed a 23-year-old sailor from Baton Rouge and then had the audacity to blame him for it. Bennett looked at him for a long moment. He did not say anything to him. He turned away, which was its own kind of statement. Shaw finished with her investigator and came to Avery. She spoke quietly, close, the way you speak when the room is full of people whose lawyers will later want to know exactly what was said and to whom. Mercer's aide is in custody, she said. He gave us the system credentials within 20 minutes of being separated from the facility. He's 22 years old, and he was following orders he was afraid to question, and his cooperation is going to be significant. He's the one who killed the archive session, Avery said. On Mercer's direct instruction, verbal, Mercer walked into the aide's workspace at 21:51 and told him to terminate the session and wipe the active transfer. The aide has the time logged in his personal record because he logged everything Mercer asked him to do. Every instruction, every time. He's been keeping the record for 4 months. Avery looked at her. He was building his own protection. a 22-year-old kid who understood exactly what he was in the middle of and was terrified enough to document everything and smart enough to keep the documentation off the facility's system. Shaw's voice carried something that was close to respect. He's going to be fine. That was the first twist that nobody in the room had seen coming. Not Mercer, not Trent, not the investigators who had spent the past weeks building the case from the outside. The insider who had been monitoring the investigation, the person Avery had identified as the threat from the moment the archive session was killed, had not been working against her. He had been watching the same things she was watching and had been quietly, systematically, protecting himself from the moment he understood what he was involved in. The record he had kept was going to make Mercer's defense significantly more difficult. Every verbal instruction, every directive to alter documentation, every order that Mercer had delivered with the confidence of a man who believed that spoken words, unlike digital records, left no trace. Avery looked across the room at Mercer. He was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the administrative authority of a facility commander, not the calculated protection of a man managing his exposure. Something older and rawer than both of those. The expression of a man who has just understood, fully and without remaining ambiguity, that he has lost. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. She had nothing to say to him. Her conversation with Commander Mercer had been conducted entirely through the documentation of what he had done and what it had cost, and that conversation was complete. Trent's attorney arrived at 12:19. He was a federal criminal defense attorney whose name Avery recognized, expensive, experienced, with a record of taking cases that looked straightforward and producing outcomes that were not. He walked into the equipment storage building, assessed the situation in approximately 15 seconds, and immediately separated Trent from the room for a private conference. Blake watched them go. He looked at his camera again. He looked at Avery. Is there anything?" He started, and then stopped, because he did not appear to know how to finish the sentence. He was looking for an exit that did not exist, and some part of him seemed to understand that, which made the searching more desperate and more futile simultaneously. "You should wait for your attorney," Avery said. It was the most practical thing she could offer him, and it was also true, and sometimes practical and true are the only things worth saying. Blake nodded. He wound the crate beside him and looked at his hands. The formal processing began at 12:30. Shaw's team worked with the efficiency of people who had been preparing for this specific morning for a significant amount of time. Avery moved through the necessary procedural elements, witness statements, evidence confirmation, chain of custody documentation with the focused attention she brought to all procedural work, which was the attention of someone who understands that cases are won and lost in the details of documentation as much as in the drama of their revelation. By 1300, the administrative wing was sealed. By 1320, Bennett had issued the emergency suspension of all diving exercises pending independent equipment review. By 1345, the 2 defense contractors whose names appeared in the falsified certification trail had received federal preservation notices. And by 1400, in a conference room that smelled like fresh coffee and recycled air, Avery sat down for the first time in 6 hours and let herself feel the edges of what had just happened. It was not over. She knew that. The proceedings were ahead of her, and the proceedings were going to be long. And the people with resources, Trent's family, Mercer's connection, the contractor whose money had built the machine that had killed Daniel Foster, were going to use all of those resources in the process of defending themselves. That was their right, and the system that gave them that right was the same system that had just done what a system is supposed to do. When it works correctly, it had found the truth and it had started the process of accountability. But sitting in that conference room at 1400, with everything that had been hidden for 8 months now visible and documented, and in federal hands, Avery allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite relief but was adjacent to both. She thought about Daniel Foster. She thought about a 23-year-old man writing 4 words to his sister and pressing send with the full understanding of what those words might cost him. She had thought about that moment many times over the course of the investigation, and each time she thought about it, she found something new in it. Today she found this, that Daniel had not sent that message because he was certain someone would act on it. He had sent it because the alternative, staying silent, looking away, doing the calculation that Trent and Blake and Cody had done and that Mercer had been doing for years, was something he could not do and still be who he was. Some people tell the truth because they believe it will change things. Some people tell the truth because they cannot imagine being the kind of person who does not. Daniel Foster had been the second kind. The formal evidence review occupied the remainder of that afternoon and stretched into the evening. Shaw's forensic team worked through the maintenance records, while Avery cross-referenced their findings against the documentation she had compiled during her 5 days at the annex. The financial investigators worked through the contractor payment records, building the detailed picture of what $340,000, routed through a holding company, had purchased over 6 years. At 1647, the physical equipment room log was found. It was in a storage archive on the lower level of the facility, filed under a standard annual documentation label, accessible to anyone with basic facility clearance. Not hidden, not destroyed. Simply present, in the place where physical logs are kept, because the person responsible for the falsification had operated with enough confidence in the digital record's dominance that it had not occurred to them that the physical record might survive. The investigator who found it brought it to Avery in a clear evidence bag. She held it and looked through the plastic at the pages. The entry for the night of Daniel Foster's exercise was there. In the equipment issue column, Unit R441 Foxtrot was listed against Foster's name. And in the margin, in the handwriting of the equipment room supervisor who had been on duty that night, the same supervisor who was now cooperating fully with the investigation, a notation in pencil. Small, easy to miss. Written in the moment and then left there because no one had thought to look for it. The notation said flagged, returned to candidate per command instruction. 4 words in a different hand. An equipment room supervisor who had flagged a defective unit, been overridden by a command instruction he was afraid to refuse, and had written it down in pencil, in the margin of a physical log, because writing it down was the only form of resistance available to him in that moment. He had done what Daniel Foster had done, in a smaller way with fewer words in pencil in a margin. But he had written it down. Avery held the evidence bag and felt something move through her chest that was large and complicated and not easily named. She called Shaw. The original physical log, she said. It has a margin notation from the equipment supervisor. Command instruction to return the flagged unit to the candidate. Shaw was quiet for 2 seconds. That establishes the override. That establishes that someone with command authority knew the unit was flagged and ordered it returned to service anyway, Avery said. The metadata from the partial digital transfer establishes that the alteration originated from Mercer's terminal. The aide's documentation establishes that Mercer issued verbal instructions to cover the alteration. And this notation establishes that the decision to deploy a known defective unit to Daniel Foster was not negligence. It was a decision. Another silence, longer. That changes the charge, Shaw said. Yes, Avery said, it does. The charge of negligent homicide was going to face a significant challenge. Because negligence implies an absence of awareness, a failure to know or to see. What the physical log established, combined with the other documentation, was not an absence of awareness. It was the presence of awareness, followed by a choice. That was a different legal territory entirely, and Trent's attorney was going to understand that immediately, and Mercer's attorney was going to understand it even faster. And the next several hours were going to be complicated. Avery set the evidence bag on the table. She thought about the equipment supervisor, a man who had been given an order he was afraid to refuse, who had found the only form of resistance available to him and used it, who had written 4 words in pencil in a margin and left them there for 8 months without knowing whether anyone would ever find them. 2 sets of 4 words, Daniel's to his sister, the supervisor's in a margin. Both of them saying the same thing in different languages. Something happened here that should not have happened. And I am writing it down because writing it down is the only thing I can do. She needed to talk to the supervisor. His name was Petty Officer Marcus Webb. He had been at the annex for 3 years. He was 28 years old, and he had been interviewed twice in the 8 months since Daniel's death by internal investigators, and both times he had answered the questions he was asked and had not volunteered the margin notation because no one had asked about it directly, and he had been living for 8 months in the specific terror of a person who knows that the thing they chose not to say loudly might eventually become the thing they are blamed for staying silent about. He came into the conference room at 17:15 and sat across from Avery with the careful posture of a man who has been managing his own anxiety for a long time and has gotten quite good at appearing calm. We found the log, Avery said. Webb looked at the table. He nodded once. The notation, Avery said. Flagged, returned to candidate per command instruction. You wrote that, yes, he said. Tell me what happened. Webb's hands were flat on the table. He looked at them. I pulled the unit for inspection during the pre-exercise equipment check. Standard procedure. I ran the seal pressure test and it was outside tolerance. I flagged it. I pulled it from the issue list and I logged the flag. He stopped. He breathed. 40 minutes later, Chief Doran came down. He was Mercer's logistics coordinator. He told me the flag was a calibration error on my test equipment and the unit was cleared for issue. Did he show you documentation? He said documentation would be updated in the system. He said it was a calibration issue on my end and I needed to issue the unit as assigned. Webb's voice was steady, but his hands pressed harder against the table. I had been in that equipment room for 8 months. Doran had been at the annex for 11 years. I asked him twice. He told me twice that the flag was my error. But you wrote the notation. I wrote the notation because... He stopped again. He looked up at Avery with the expression of a man who has been waiting for 8 months to tell someone why he did the only thing he could figure out to do. Because I was 27 years old and I was being told by someone with 11 years and a rank I did not have that my test equipment was miscalibrated. And I did not know how to refuse a direct instructions from a senior logistic, but I knew. His voice shifted. I knew the flag was correct. I had run that test procedure 300 times. That seal was not within tolerance, and I knew it. And I issued the unit anyway because I was told to, and I wrote it down because writing it down was the only thing I could do. He looked at his hands again. He died, Webb said. And I had that notation in the log and I knew what it meant, and I did not tell anyone because I was terrified that telling anyone would make me the person responsible for not refusing the order. And the longer I didn't say anything, the more terrified I got. And then 8 months went by, Marcus Avery said. He looked up. You flagged the unit correctly. You attempted to remove it from service. You were overridden by a senior officer operating on command authority. You documented what happened in the only way available to you. What you should have done, what would have been the right thing, was to escalate above Doran immediately and refuse the reissue. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. But what you did, she continued, was write it down. And that notation, 4 words in a margin of a physical log, is part of what is going to establish criminal accountability for the person who gave that order. Webb was very still. Your notation matters, Avery said. It matters significantly. And the fact that you kept it, that you left it there for 8 months without destroying it, even when the safest thing for you personally would have been to make it disappear, that matters too. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved, something that had been held very tightly for a long time and was receiving for the first time permission to be something other than fear. Is there going to be a You cooperated fully, Avery said. Your notation is corroborating evidence that establishes a command override. Your cooperation today is going to be documented as voluntary and comprehensive. I cannot tell you what every outcome will be, but I can tell you that your choice to write it down and your choice today to tell me what happened are the choices of someone who is trying to do the right thing. He nodded. He kept nodding for a moment longer than was necessary, the way people nod when what they are actually doing is letting something settle. Chief Doran, he said, he's still here. He's been in the facility all day. He doesn't know about Doran, Avery said. He's being interviewed right now. Webb looked at her. He followed orders too, from Mercer. He stopped. He seemed to be working out whether the question he wanted to ask was one he was allowed to ask. Does that make it better, that he was following orders? Avery was quiet for a moment. Following orders explains a decision, she said. It does not excuse one. The standard we use to evaluate what happened here is not whether each person in the chain was afraid to refuse. Most of them were. The standard is whether, at the moment when a decision was made that could cost a person their life, someone stopped and said no. Someone refused held that. Nobody did, he said quietly. Nobody did, Avery said, except Daniel Foster, who refused to stay silent about it. And you, who refused to destroy what you had written. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. He looked at the wall with the expression of a man who is doing the specific work of integrating something, not accepting it, not dismissing it, but actually sitting with it and finding the shape of it. I'm going to have to live with this for a long time, he said. Yes, Avery said. She did not offer him a more comfortable version of that truth, because a more comfortable version would have been a lie, and Marcus Webb had already had enough of the things that comfortable versions of the truth produce. He left the conference room at 1750. Avery sat alone for 4 minutes. She sat with the accumulated weight of the day, the arrests, the evidence, the AIDS records, the physical log, Cody's account during the proffer session that afternoon, Webb's penciled notation, the whole layered structure of choices that had produced a 23-year-old man's death and had then been covered by more choices and then finally exposed by 4 words sent to a sister in Baton Rouge who had not let them go. She thought about something that a mentor had told her early in her career during the debrief of an investigation that had technically succeeded and had felt, in its aftermath, like something other than success. He had said, the cases that matter most are never clean. They are full of people who made small wrong choices, and people who made large wrong choices, and people who knew something and stayed silent, and people who did not know enough and spoke up anyway. Your job is not to sort them into clean categories. Your job is to find the truth and make sure it goes somewhere. It cannot be erased. She had found the truth. She had made sure it went somewhere. It could not be erased. The rest of the proceedings, the sentences, the appeals, the reforms, the long institutional reckoning that was going to occupy this facility for years, all of that was the work that came after. Important work, necessary work, work that she would support and contribute to and advocate for at every step. But the truth was out, and it was permanent, and it belonged now to the record, to Daniel's family, to the official documentation of what had happened in this facility on the night a 23-year-old man who had done everything right had been sent into dark water with equipment that had been known to be defective and had been deployed anyway under command instruction. At 18:10, Shaw came back into the conference room. Mercer's attorney has seen the physical log, she said. And he requested a meeting with Hubbard's prosecutor at 1800. The meeting lasted 6 minutes. Shaw sat down across from Avery. He is exploring cooperation options. Avery looked at her. Mercer is looking to cooperate, she said. He is looking to mitigate, Shaw said, which is not the same thing. But what he has to offer, the full financial trail of the contractor relationship, the names of everyone in the payment structure above Trent's father, the complete chain of command involved in the documentation falsification is going to be relevant to a larger investigation that goes well beyond this facility. How much larger? At least 3 other training installations, possibly 5. Same contractor relationship, same component supply chain, same certification falsification pattern. Shaw looked at her. We are not the only annex where this happened. We are just the one where a candidate was brave enough to say something about it. The room went very quiet. Avery felt the shape of that settle around her. 3 other installations, possibly 5, which meant the defective equipment, the falsified certifications, the command culture that had allowed it to propagate. None of it had been unique to this facility. It had been a system with a financial structure behind it, and enough institutional protection that it had survived for years across multiple locations without anyone looking closely enough to dismantle it. Until Daniel Foster had sent 4 words to his sister. Until one 23-year-old sailor had decided that something wrong should be said out loud, regardless of what saying it cost him. The investigation expands, Avery said. Significantly, Shaw confirmed. Avery looked at the table. She thought about the scope of it, the other facilities, the other candidates, the other equipment supervisors who might have written something in a margin and been too afraid to say it loudly, the other Daniel Fosters who might be in those facilities right now, seeing something wrong and trying to decide whether saying so was worth the cost. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about one thing at a time, because all of it at once was not actionable, and one thing at a time was, and the one thing that was in front of her right now was making sure that everything they had built it today held together well enough to carry the weight of what came next. The physical log, she said. Full chain of custody. Locked, Shaw said. The AIDS documentation, secured and transmitted to the federal evidence server. Cody's proffer on record. Blake's camera footage. Logged and preserved. The partial digital transfer with the metadata fragment. Forensics confirmed this afternoon it is sufficient to establish the alteration as deliberate rather than administrative error. Avery nodded, one by one. Each element confirmed. The case was solid. Not perfect, no case was ever perfect, and Trent's attorney and Mercer's attorney were going to work very hard in the months ahead to find every imperfection and widen it. But solid. Built from real evidence and real testimony, and a physical log that nobody had thought to destroy, and a penciled notation from a 28-year-old equipment supervisor who had known he was being told to do something wrong and had written it down, because writing it down was the only resistance he could manage. We're going to need to move fast on the other facilities, Avery said. I know, Shaw said. I've already started the preliminary requests. Before Mercer's cooperation conversation goes any further, before anyone in those facilities has any reason to think we're coming. Ahead of you, Shaw said. She almost smiled. It was the specific almost smile of a federal agent who has been doing this work long enough to anticipate the moves that matter and has already made them. Avery looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. Bennett needs to know the scope, she said. He's going to be asked to cooperate with investigations at other facilities. His credibility, his institutional knowledge of how this documentation falsification operates from the inside, it's going to be relevant. I'll brief him tomorrow morning. Tonight, Avery said. He's been carrying this for 8 months. He deserves to know tonight that what he helped us build is going to matter beyond this facility. Shaw looked at her for a moment. Tonight, she agreed. Avery stood up. She had been sitting for too long, and her body registered it in the specific way of a body that has been pushed through a significant amount of physical and cognitive demand over 5 continuous days and is beginning to submit the invoice. She walked to the window. She looked out at the training ground, empty now. In the early evening, the equipment from the day's suspended exercises still laid out in the configuration it had been in when Bennett ordered the suspension. She looked at it for a long time. Somewhere on that ground, 5 days ago, she had stood in a line of 40 men who had decided in 4 seconds that she was not worth taking seriously. 3 of them had spent the next 5 days working very hard to make her disappear from a facility she had been sent to because a 23-year-old sailor from Baton Rouge had told his sister something was wrong. She was still here. The 3 of them were not. She thought about Trent on the floor of the equipment building, the moment when the arrogance had gone completely from his face and been replaced by something rawer and younger. She thought about Blake with the camera in his lap, looking at it like it had betrayed him. She thought about Cody in the conference room that afternoon, speaking carefully and precisely about 11 minutes, and a distress signal and a look he had exchanged with Trent while a man was struggling underwater. She did not feel triumphant. She had never been there to feel triumphant. Triumph was the wrong category for what this work produced. What it produced was this: the truth, documented and permanent, in a form that the people who had built their safety pulse in its absence could no longer reach. That was what she had come here for. That was what Daniel Foster had sent her here for. Without knowing he was sending her, when he typed 4 words to his sister and pressed send and trusted that the truth, once spoken, goes somewhere. It had gone somewhere. It had come here. And it was not finished yet. The arrests happened fast. That was the part nobody who witnessed them would forget, not the drama of it, not the shouting or the resistance, but the speed. The way a system that had operated for years with absolute confidence in its own permanence could be disassembled in a single morning with the right paperwork and the right people carrying it. By 1400 that same day, federal investigators had sealed the administrative wing. By 1630, they had pulled every maintenance record in the facility going back 4 years. By 1900, 2 private contractors whose names appeared repeatedly in the falsified certification trail had received federal preservation orders for their financial and communications records. Avery sat in a temporary command space that Shaw's team had established in a training room on the east side of the annex, and she worked through the initial evidence organization with the focused efficiency of someone who knows that the hours immediately following an arrest are when a case either solidifies or begins to develop the cracks that defense attorneys spend the next 2 years widening. She had not slept. She was not going to sleep yet. Shaw came in at 1940 and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of her without being asked. She sat down across from Avery and opened her own file. Cody Vance requested counsel at 14:15, Shaw said. His attorney arrived at 1700. At 1740, they requested a proffer session. Avery looked up from the document she was reviewing. How fast? 3 hours and 25 minutes from arrest to cooperation request, Shaw said. That is a man who has been carrying something heavy and is very relieved to be given a place to set it down. What's he offering? Full account of the night exercise. His own role, Trent's role, and everything Mercer communicated to them in the 48 hours following Daniel Foster's death. Shaw paused. He says Mercer called them into his office the morning after. Individually, not together. And he told each of them separately that what had happened was a training accident, that the equipment failure was a contributing factor, but the primary cause was candidate error, and that anyone who said otherwise was going to find themselves at the center of an investigation into their own conduct. Avery set down her pen. He threatened them, she said. He threatened them, Shaw confirmed. Cody was 24 years old. He had a spotless record, a family that had sacrificed significantly to support his military career, and a commander telling him that speaking would destroy everything he had built. So he didn't speak. And Trent is not talking. His attorney arrived at 1500 and has been talking for him ever since. The current position is that Trent acted in good faith throughout, had no knowledge of the equipment falsification, and that what happened during the night exercise was a tragic accident that he reported as soon as he was able to determine a genuine emergency was occurring. Avery was quiet for a moment, the 11-minute gap. They're calling it a perception discrepancy under stress conditions. Cody's account contradicts that. Cody's account will be characterized by Trent's defense as the self-serving testimony of a cooperating witness seeking favorable treatment. Shaw said it without editorial, just the clean statement of the legal reality. We need the original exercise report, the one with the unaltered timestamp. What we have in the partial transfer is 63% of it. Is the metadata fragment enough to establish the alteration as deliberate? Forensics says probably yes, but probably is not the word we want in front of a grand jury. They can establish that the file was modified at a terminal in Mercer's suite, at a time when Mercer's own access badge showed him in that suite. What they cannot definitively establish from the fragment is whether the modification was authorized as a standard administrative correction or deliberate tampering. Because the fragment cuts off before the authorization field, Avery said. Correct. Avery looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about Bennett's office. The progress bar at 63%, the screen going black, the specific cruelty of being that close to something and having it taken away at the last possible moment. The original paper log, she said. The night exercise would have had a physical check-in record. Equipment issue, personnel assignment, the whole sequence. Digital records can be altered. Paper logs from the equipment room if they still exist. We've already requested them, Shaw said. The equipment room supervisor is cooperating. He says the physical logs from that period are archived in the facility storage. We have a team going through them right now. Avery nodded. She picked up her coffee. Blake? She asked. Blake Rourke gave a full statement at 1600 without waiting for his attorney to advise him, Shaw said, and something in her voice carried a note that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. He appears to have convinced himself that cooperation will result in no charges, which is not an accurate understanding of his situation. But his statement is comprehensive and his access to the group's internal communications text messages. Encrypted app exchanges going back 14 months is significant. How significant? Shaw set a tablet on the table and turned it to face Avery. The screen showed a series of message exchanges. She scrolled through them without touching the tablet. The messages were between Trent, Blake, and Cody. They spanned 14 months. They documented the equipment switches, the discussion of which candidates were being targeted for pressure, references to Mercer that were oblique but traceable, and most significantly, a 3-message exchange dated 2 days before Daniel Foster's death. The first message was from Cody. He's going to report it. Saw him at the office building after hours. The second was from Trent. Let him, or we deal with it first. The third was from Trent again, sent 4 hours later, equipment room. Tomorrow morning, I'll handle the assignment. Avery read the exchange twice. She set the tablet down. That's premeditation, she said. That is premeditation, Shaw said. The words sat in the room between them with everything it changed. This was no longer 3 young men making a bad decision under pressure. This was planning. This was the deliberate selection of a course of action with the understanding of what that action was intended to produce. The fact that the specific outcome, Daniel's death, was not what they had intended did not erase the chain of choices that had produced it. Trent's attorney is going to argue the equipment switch was intended to be temporary, Avery said, that they planned to restore it before the exercise. They can argue that, Shaw said. They can argue it against those 3 messages, against Cody's testimony, against the falsified certification trail that shows R441 Foxtrot had been in a known defective state for 14 months, and against an 11-minute delay in reporting a visible distress signal. She closed her file. Let them argue. Avery looked at the table. She thought about Daniel Foster. She thought about the specific sequence of it, the confrontations, the threat, the equipment room the following morning, the exercise 2 nights later, the signal, the 11 minutes. She had been building a picture of this sequence for weeks, from documents and access logs and metadata fragments. Hearing it confirmed, having it sit in front of her as an established evidentiary record rather than an investigative conclusion, produced a feeling that she had not anticipated. Not relief, not satisfaction, something heavier than both. His family thinks it was his fault. She said yes, Shaw said. She said it quietly. The specific quiet of someone who understands that this is the part of the work that the official record does not fully account for. I need to talk to his sister, Avery said, Lauren Foster. She's been notified that the investigation has produced significant new findings. She's willing to meet. Not a formal notification, Avery said. I need to talk to her myself. Shaw looked at her. That's not standard protocol. No, Avery agreed. A pause. I'll arrange it, Shaw said. The meeting with Commander Mercer's formal arrest processing took place the following morning at 900. Avery was not in the room. She did not need to be. The investigators who had spent the night going through the financial records had assembled a picture that was more comprehensive than even her preliminary findings had indicated. The contractor payments, which had been structured as consulting fees, routed through a holding company connected to Trent's father, totaled over $340,000 over 6 years. In exchange, the annex had purchased diving equipment components from that contractor at above-market rates. The equipment, according to independent technical assessors brought in overnight, was manufactured to specifications below those required by naval training standards. In some cases, significantly below. R-441 Foxtrot had been manufactured by that contractor, so had 7 other regulators still in active rotation at the annex. 4 of them, under the overnight independent inspection Bennett had ordered as his first act in temporary command, had been pulled from service. Mercer, in his initial processing interview before his attorney arrived and stopped him from speaking, had said one sentence that became the most quoted line of the entire investigation: "I maintained the program's performance record. That is what I was there to do." When Bennett heard that sentence, he was standing in the equipment room watching an inspector tag a 4th defective regulator with a red out-of-service marker. He heard it from a colleague who had been in the processing room. He stood very still for a moment and then he said, without turning around, Daniel Foster was the program's performance record. He performed exactly as he was supposed to perform when he saw something wrong. And look what that cost him. Nobody in the equipment room said anything after that. Avery heard about Mercer's sentence later that morning. She wrote it down verbatim in her investigation notes, not because it was legally significant, but because it was the truest expression she had encountered of the specific psychology that had made all of this possible. A man who had confused the appearance of a functioning system with an actual functioning system, and had spent years maintaining these so successfully that he had stopped being able to tell the difference. The grand jury proceedings were formally initiated at 10:30. The charges against Mercer were extensive: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, evidence tampering, accepting illegal payments, and the charge that his attorney immediately flagged as the most contested negligent homicide in connection with the death of Daniel Foster through the deliberate concealment of known equipment deficiencies. Trent Maddox faced charges that included conspiracy, evidence tampering, and the charge his attorney was preparing to fight with every available resource: reckless endangerment resulting in death, connected to the 11-minute delay. Blake Rourke, with his comprehensive cooperation and his attorney's aggressive advocacy, was looking at significantly reduced exposure. He understood this and expressed it in the specific way of a man who has been very frightened and is now very relieved and is not yet fully processing the fact that relief and accountability are not the same thing. Cody Vance sat across from Avery in a conference room at 11:15 that morning. His attorney sat beside him. Cody had asked specifically to speak with Avery, which his attorney had advised against, and which he had insisted on anyway. He looked different than he had in the equipment storage building. The precision was still there. Cody Vance was not a man who became unrecognizable under pressure, but the careful, measured quality of it had changed. He was no longer precise because he was calculating. He was precise because it was the only way he knew how to say something he had been trying not to say for 8 months. "I want to tell you what happened," he said. "Not for the record. Not for the statement. I already gave the statement. I want to tell you what it was actually like." His attorney placed a hand on the table. "Cody, it's fine," Cody said. He looked at Avery. "I want her to know." Avery looked at the attorney and then back at Cody. "I'm listening," she said. "He was in the water for a while before I saw it," Cody said. "The signal. We were doing the transit sequence, and I was on the surface team and I saw the light, the emergency light, and he stopped. His jaw worked. I looked at Trent." Avery waited. "Trent was already looking at me," Cody said. He had already seen it, and he looked at me and I could see him doing the calculation. What it would mean if we reported it immediately, whether the regulator would be traceable, whether Daniel would survive it, whether he stopped again. I told myself for 8 months that the delay was short, that 11 minutes was nothing, that by the time we reported it, there was nothing that could have been different. "But you don't believe that," Avery said. "No," Cody said. Very quiet. "I don't believe that." He looked at his hands. "I was 24 years old," he said, "and I was scared. And Trent was the person I had been following for 2 years because I believed that following him would take me where I wanted to go. And in the moment when it actually mattered, when a man's life was the actual stakes, I followed him again." He looked up. "I don't know how to explain what it is like to live with that. I'm not asking you to make it easier. I just wanted someone who knew the whole truth to hear me say it." The room was very quiet. "I hear you," Avery said. She said it simply, without absolution and without condemnation. She heard him. That was what he had asked for. That was what she could give him. His attorney touched his arm. "That's enough, Cody." Cody nodded. He stood up. At the door, he turned back. "Is his sister, does she?" "She's going to know the truth," Avery said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he left. Avery sat alone in the conference room for 60 seconds after the door closed. She sat with everything Cody had described: the signal, the surface, the light, the look between two men, making a calculation over a third man's life. And she sat with it the way she had learned to sit with things that could not be unfelt, which was without trying to put them down too quickly. Some things deserved to be felt for a moment before you moved on from them. Then she stood up and went to find Bennett. He was in the equipment room. He had been in the equipment room for most of the morning, supervising the independent inspection alongside the technical team, going through every piece of diving equipment in the facility with the systematic attention of a man who understood that trust, once broken in a space like this, has to be rebuilt from the ground up or not at all. 4 pulled from service so far, he told her. The inspector thinks we may find 2 more before we're through the full inventory. Good, she said. He looked at her. How's it going in there? Cody testified this morning, she said. His account of the night exercise is complete and consistent with the timeline discrepancy in the records. Bennett was quiet for a moment. Will it be enough? For Mercer, yes. She paused. It will be enough. It may take longer. Bennett nodded. He looked at the inspector marking a regulator with red tape. He watched the inspector move to the next unit. He watched with the expression of a man who is doing penance, not by suffering but by working, which is the only kind of penance that actually changes anything. I owe you an apology, he said. Avery looked at him. For what? For the first 2 days, he said. I watched what Trenton Blake and Cody were doing. The deliberate collision, the public mockery, the harassment. I watched it and I told myself it was within the acceptable range of training culture friction. I told myself you were competent enough to manage it without intervention. I was, Avery said. That's not the point, Bennett said. The point is I saw it and I made a calculation about whether it was worth the friction of addressing it, and I decided it was not. That is how systems like this one survive. Not because everyone in them is corrupt, because the people who are not corrupt make small calculations about what is worth addressing and what is easier to let pass. He looked at her directly. I made that calculation about you, and I made it about Daniel a long time ago, in small ways before it became the way it became. Avery held his gaze for a moment. You stopped making it, she said. Late, he said. Yes, but you stopped. He looked back at the inspector. I'm putting a formal reporting system in place before the week is out. Anonymous submissions, independent review. No commander-level filtering on safety concerns. That's the right call. It should have been in place 4 years ago, he said. Yes, she agreed. It should have. She did not offer him comfort beyond that. He did not seem to want it. He seemed to want the truth, spoken plainly, without the cushioning that people sometimes apply to truths, because they believe the recipient cannot bear the full weight of them. Bennett could bear it. That was the thing she had understood about him from the moment he had asked her about Daniel in the dark outside his office. He could bear it, and he needed to bear it, because the bearing of it was the thing that was going to make him the leader this facility needed. The meeting with Lauren Foster took place that evening at a neutral location off the base, a small conference room in a federal building, not a formal deposition room, not an investigative space, just a room with a table and chairs and 2 women sitting across from each other with the whole weight of 8 months between them. Lauren was 31. She had Daniel's same quality of stillness, the kind that does not come from passivity but from the decision to listen fully before responding. She had driven 3 hours to be here. She had taken the day off from a job she had gone back to 6 weeks after her brother's death, because stopping would have meant sitting still, and sitting still would have meant feeling the full scope of it before she had any context for what she was feeling. She looked at Avery across the table with clear, careful eyes. Tell me, she said, all of it. Don't protect me from any of it. Avery told her. She told her about R441 Foxtrot and the falsified certifications and the 14 months of a known defective regulator being rotated back into service. She told her about the message exchange 2 days before the exercise, Cody's warning, Trent's response, the equipment room the following morning. She told her about the night exercise and the distress signal and the 11 minutes. She told her about the original log with the handwritten notation flag for replacement and the submitted version with nothing. She told her about Commander Mercer calling 3 frightened young men into his office individually and building a wall of silence around them with the specific mortar of threatened careers and implied consequences. She told her about the 4 words Daniel had sent to her, and how those 4 words had initiated the investigation that had produced everything in this room. Lauren listened to all of it. She did not look away. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and they were completely still, and her face was doing the complicated work of a person who is receiving information that is both the worst thing they have ever heard and the answer to the question that has been destroying them. When Avery finished, Lauren was quiet for a long time. He knew what he was doing, she finally said. He sent me that message. He knew what it might start. Yes, Avery said, and he did it anyway. He did it anyway. Lauren's breath came out in a long, slow release. I spent 8 months believing he made a mistake, she said. They told me he was careless, that he missed something he should have caught. I kept trying to figure out how Daniel, my Daniel, who was the most careful person I have ever known, how he could have missed something that basic. And I kept coming back to this idea that maybe I hadn't known him the way I thought I did. That maybe there was a version of him that existed in that world that I didn't have access to. She looked at Avery. He didn't miss anything, she said. It was not a question. He saw everything, Avery said. He saw it clearly and accurately, and he reported it correctly. The equipment failure was not his error. The flag notation in the original log proves that he had even identified the specific unit that was the risk. He did everything right, everything he was supposed to do. Something moved through Lauren's face that was not quite relief and was not quite grief, something that was both of those things simultaneously, which is what happens when a truth that heals you and a truth that breaks you are the exact same truth. He wasn't careless, she said. No, Avery said. He was the most precise person in that facility on the day it mattered most. Lauren pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. One moment controlled, and then she lowered it. What happens now, she said. To the people responsible. Avery told her about the charges, the grand jury proceedings, the expected timeline. She did not soften it or inflate it. She explained the process honestly, including the parts that were slow and contested and uncertain. She explained that Mercer's attorney was going to fight the most serious charge, that Trent's defense was going to argue the delay, and that arguing the delay was going to be painful for the people who loved Daniel to watch from the outside. It's going to take time, Avery said, and parts of it are going to be hard. But the truth is out, Lauren said. The truth is out, Avery said. It's documented. It's corroborated. It's in federal hands, and it cannot be taken back. Whatever the proceedings produce, the truth of what happened to your brother is established. It belongs to the record now. No one can change it. Lauren looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at Avery. His record, she said, the official one. It still says, it's being corrected, Avery said. Formally, his service record will be amended to remove all references to personal negligence. His family will receive a formal public apology from the Department of Defense. His name will be cleared of every characterization of error that was placed there to protect the people responsible for his death. Lauren was very still for a moment. He just wanted to do the right thing, she said. That's all he ever wanted. He called me the week before he deployed there and he said, Lauren, this is the thing I've been working toward my whole life, and I'm going to do it right. That's what he said. He was so serious about it, so determined. Her voice held steady, but the effort was visible. 23 years old and already so determined to do everything the right way. He did, Avery said. He did it the right way. The system around him did not. Lauren looked at her. You went in there for him. I went in there because he told the truth, and the truth deserved to be heard, Avery said. That's the same thing, Lauren said. Avery did not argue with that. Lauren started. She stopped. She started again. At the end, in the water. Avery had known this question was coming. She had thought about how to answer it. She had decided before she walked into this room that Lauren Foster deserved the truth about this as much as she deserved the truth about everything else. I don't know what those final minutes felt like, Avery said. I can't know that. Nobody can know that. But I know this. Daniel had been brave long before he went into that water. He had seen a dangerous system, understood exactly what challenging it was going to cost him, and he chose to challenge it anyway. That kind of courage does not disappear in a difficult moment. It is present in all the moments that come before it, and it was fully present in his. Lauren held that for a moment. He wasn't afraid to tell the truth, she said. Even when the truth was hard. No, Avery said he was not. Lauren looked at the table. Then she said something that Avery had not expected, in a voice that was very quiet and completely certain. He would have liked you, she said. He always said the bravest people are the ones who do the right thing when nobody is watching. Avery felt something move through her chest that she did not have a quick name for. She let it be there. Your brother was the bravest person in that facility, she said. He was the first person there, strong enough to tell the truth. Everything that is being corrected right now, every falsified record, Every charge, every safety reform that Bennett is putting in place, all of it traces back to 4 words that your brother sent to you. Lauren Foster looked at her with her brother's clear, careful eyes. Something is wrong here, she said softly. Something is, Avery said. And because he said so, something is finally going to be right. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was the specific kind of silence that fills a space after everything that needed to be said has been said, and the 2 people in it are sitting with the full weight of it together rather than each carrying it separately. Outside the building, the evening had arrived in the particular way. Evenings arrive after days that have contained too much slowly, like it is not sure it has permission to come yet. Avery sat across from Lauren Foster and did not rush her. She thought about Daniel, about the 4 words, about the choice he had made alone, in a facility where 3 men with powerful connections and a commander willing to do anything to protect his record had made it absolutely clear that the cost of truth was everything. He had told the truth anyway, and somewhere in the machinery of consequence and accountability, that truth had set in motion 8 months after a 23-year-old man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had gone into dark water and not come back up. His sister was sitting in a plain room being given back the version of her brother that had always been true. It was not enough. Avery knew that. It was never going to be enough, because there is no version of enough that returns a person to the family that lost them. She had learned that a long time ago. Justice and enough are not the same word. But it was true, and it was permanent, and no terminal in any administrative suite could take it back. That had to matter. She was going to make sure it mattered. The grand jury proceedings began on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the arrests. Avery was not in the courtroom for the opening. She was in a federal building 2 blocks away, sitting across from a prosecutor named Diana Holt, who had a reputation for taking cases that looked impossible and finding the load-bearing wall inside them. Holt had been reading for 3 hours before Avery arrived. Stack of documentation on her desk: maintenance records, financial trails, the aide's contemporaneous logs. Cody's proffer, the physical equipment log, with Webb's penciled notation, was thick enough to use as a doorstop. She looked up when Avery sat down and said, without preamble, "Walk me through the 11 minutes." Avery walked her through it. She started with the message exchange, Cody's warning to Trent 2 days before the exercise. Trent's response, the equipment room the following morning. She moved through the night exercise timeline, the distress signal, the 11-minute gap between Cody's confirmed visual of the signal and the moment Trent initiated the report. She laid out the original exercise log against the submitted version, the metadata establishing the alteration terminal, the aide's documentation of Mercer's verbal instruction to kill the archive session, and then she set the evidence photograph of the physical log on the desk. Webb's notation, flagged return to candidate per command instruction. Holt looked at it for a long time. He was 27 years old, Holt said. Webb, 27, Avery confirmed, and he wrote this in pencil. In a margin. Yes, because he was afraid to refuse the order and afraid to say nothing, and this was the only thing he could find in between. Yes. Holt set the photograph down. She looked at Avery. What do you need from me to make this hold? The financial trail is complete, Avery said. The contractor payment structure connects Mercer to Trent's father's company through 4 documented transactions disguised as consulting fees. The defective component supply chain is established through independent technical assessment of 7 units, including R441 Foxtrot. The falsification pattern is documented across 14 months and connected to at least 3 people with system authentication access. She paused. What I need from you is to make the jury understand that this was not a series of isolated bad decisions. This was a system. It was built deliberately. It was maintained deliberately, and the death of Daniel Foster was its consequence. Holt looked at the stack of documentation on her desk. That's what I do, she said. The proceedings ran for 11 weeks. Avery was not present for most of them. She was in transit, moving between the 3 other facilities that the expanded investigation had identified, working with Shaw's team to establish whether the documentation falsification pattern extended beyond the Coronado Annex. She already knew the answer before the first site visit was complete. The pattern was not identical at each facility, because the people running it had developed local variations over time. But the structure was the same. The contractor relationship was the same. The gap between what the official records said and what the physical evidence showed was the same. Same machine, different rooms. She called Shaw from a parking lot outside the second facility at 2200 on a Thursday night, standing in the cold with her breath coming out white. It's here too, she said. How bad? Shaw asked. 2 fatalities in the past 3 years. Both attributed to candidate error. both with documentation anomalies that we are going to find very familiar. Silence on the line. 2 more Daniel Fosters, Shaw said. 2 more Daniel Fosters, Avery said, and we don't know their names yet. She stood in the parking lot for a moment after the call ended. She stood with the weight of it, not just the cases, not just the work, but the specific knowledge that the system she had exposed at one facility had been operating in at least 3 others, had taken at least 2 more lives, and had done it with enough institutional cover that it had survived for years without anyone looking closely enough. Until Daniel Foster's 4 words had started the chain. She thought about that, about the specific geometry of consequence, how one person's decision to tell the truth could travel outward in directions they could not have mapped and touch people they would never meet. Daniel had not known about the other facilities. He had not known about the other candidates. He had known only what he had seen in his own facility, and he had said so, and the saying of it had eventually produced an investigation that was now finding the edges of something much larger than a single annex's corruption. One truth, multiple rooms. She got back in the car and drove to the next site. The Coronado proceedings produced their verdicts 8 weeks after Avery returned from the expanded investigation work. She was in Washington when the news came through briefing with the DOD Inspector General's office about the scope of this systemic investigation, scheduled to last 3 hours and running into its 5th. Shaw texted her at 14:17. The message said Mercer, guilty on all counts. Avery read it once. She set the phone face down on the table and returned her attention to the briefing. The Inspector General's deputy, a careful man named Reeves, who had been in that office for 16 years, noticed the text arriving, but did not ask about it. He kept his eyes on the presentation. At 14:22, another text. Rourke, guilty. Full cooperation reflected in sentencing recommendation. At 14:31, Vance, guilty. Testimony weight acknowledged. Avery kept her attention on the briefing. At 14:48, the final text. Maddox, guilty. Reckless endangerment resulting in death. Obstruction. Conspiracy. Sentencing in 6 weeks. She set the phone down again. She breathed once, steadily, the way she had learned to breathe in situations that required her to remain present when what she was feeling was large enough to make presence difficult. Reeves looked at her across the table. He had been in his position long enough to have sat in rooms with people receiving significant news and had learned to recognize the specific stillness of someone managing it. Take a moment if you need it, he said. Quiet, not unkind. I'm fine, Avery said. Continue, he continued. She processed the news in the way she processed most things, not in the moment, but in the margins around it. The drive back to her hotel that evening. The 30 minutes she sat in the parking lot before going inside. The specific quality of quiet that arrives when something you have been working toward for a significant amount of time is finally finished, and the work it took to get there suddenly has no more demands to make of you. Mercer would serve time. The financial investigation had produced additional charges connected to the broader contractor network that would extend his exposure significantly. Trent faced the longest sentence of the 3 candidates. Reckless endangerment resulting in death was a charge that his attorney had fought hard and lost. And the 11-minute gap that had been characterized as a perception discrepancy under stress had been established through Cody's testimony and Webb's notation and the physical log as a knowing delay by someone who understood exactly what was at stake and chose his own exposure over another person's life. Blake's cooperation had been reflected in his sentencing recommendation, the way his attorney had promised it would be, which did not erase what he had done, but did acknowledge that what he had chosen to do with the camera, the unbroken recording that had given federal investigators 51 minutes of admissible evidence, had mattered. Cody had testified, fully consistently at cost to himself. His sentence was the lightest of the 3, and Avery understood that, and also understood that Cody Vance was going to spend a very long time working out what it meant to have been in that water, watching that signal, looking at Trent and making the choice he made. Some accountabilities live in the official record. Some live only in the person who carries them. Both are real. Daniel Foster's official record was corrected on a Monday morning in December, 14 months after his death. Avery was not there for the ceremony. She had been asked whether she wanted to attend, and she had said no, that the ceremony was for Daniel's family and his colleagues, and the people whose daily work in uniform was what the correction actually honored, and that her presence would redirect attention toward the investigation rather than toward him. She found out about it through Bennett. He called her at 9:43 that morning, after the ceremony had concluded. His sister was there, he said, Lauren. She stood in front of the corrected record, and she didn't say anything for a long time. And then she said he would have been embarrassed by all the attention. And then she laughed, just for a second. And it sounded exactly like something someone says about a real person. About someone they actually knew. Avery listened. The plaque is up, Bennett said. His voice shifted slightly. Not breaking, just carrying something visible in it. Outside my office, his words. Standards mean nothing if truth can be changed. I asked Lauren before I ordered it. She said he wrote it in a letter to a friend at the academy 2 years before he was assigned here. He was 19 years old when he wrote that. He knew what he believed, Avery said. He always knew, Bennett said. She sat with it for a moment. How's the program? She asked. Independent inspectors came through last week. Clean on everything we've replaced or recertified. The confidential reporting system has had 14 submissions in the first month. 2 of them identified legitimate safety concerns that we addressed before they became anything more. He paused. 14 submissions in a month. From a culture that 6 weeks ago couldn't produce a single person willing to say something out loud. 14, Avery said. 14, he confirmed. Daniel would have been the 15th. Except he didn't have a system to submit to. He sent a text to his sister instead. Avery was quiet for a moment. You're going to be good at this, Noah, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He registered it, she could tell from the brief pause. I'm going to try every day. I'm going to try every day. She accepted the position of director of the Special Oversight and Readiness Unit in January. It was not a position she had sought. Shaw had recommended her. Reeves at the Inspector General's office had supported the recommendation. 3 separate people in the process had told her it was a natural extension of what she had already demonstrated she could do. She had taken 2 weeks before answering, not because she was uncertain about the work, because she wanted to be certain about her reasons for doing it. There is a difference between taking a position because it is the logical next step in a career and taking a position because the work that position requires is work you understand to be necessary in a way that is specific and personal and not transferable to someone else. She understood this work to be necessary in that specific way. She accepted. Her first hire was Marcus Webb, the equipment supervisor with the penciled notation. He had been separated from the annex during the investigation and was navigating the specific difficulty of a person who cooperated fully with a federal investigation and still lost the position they had built their identity around. She brought him in as a technical advisor for equipment certification assessment. His knowledge of how certification systems could be manipulated from the inside, from the ground level, from the position of someone who was handed a defective unit and told to issue it anyway, was exactly the kind of knowledge that an oversight unit needed to translate policy into practice. He showed up on his first day with the careful posture of a man who was not yet sure he was allowed to be there. Avery met him at the entrance. You're late, she said. He looked at the clock on the wall. He was 4 minutes early. No, I'm not, he said. Good, she said, don't be. It was the first time she had seen him smile without the anxiety underneath it. She walked him to his office and left him to start. The first training class for the new investigators unit began in February. 12 people, selected from a pool of candidates that had been evaluated not only on their technical and operational qualifications, but on a specific set of attributes that Avery had written into the selection criteria herself. Willingness to challenge authority through legitimate channels, demonstrate a history of raising concerns in previous assignments, and the ability to hold 2 things simultaneously: genuine respect for institutional structure and genuine independence from it when the structure is failing. Finding people who had both was harder than it sounded. Most people are good at one. The best investigators needed to be genuinely capable of the other. She stood in front of the 12 people on the first morning and looked at them for a moment before speaking. They were a mixed group, different backgrounds, different operational histories, different ages and ranks and reasons for being in the room. What they had in common was that every one of them had, at some point in their career, seen something wrong and said so when the easier choice was silence. She knew this because she had read every one of their files. You are here, she said, because at some point you chose the harder option. You are here because that choice has value, and because we are going to spend the next several months building skills that give that choice the best possible chance of actually changing something. She looked at them. You are not here to be heroes, she said. Heroes are a story we tell after the fact to make difficult choices feel more exceptional than they are. What you are here to learn is how to do this work consistently, without applause, in systems that are often actively resistant to what you are trying to do, with evidence that is rarely as clean as you would like it to be. She paused. The most important skill I can teach you is not tactical. It is not investigative technique. It is this: knowing the difference between a system that is demanding and a system that is abusive. knowing the difference between loyalty and silence, knowing the difference between confidence and arrogance, and knowing that the cost of confusing those things is paid by the people who can least afford it. The room was very quiet. A young investigator in the second row, she had read his file, a 26-year-old from Pensacola, who had twice filed formal complaints in previous assignments and had twice been transferred for his trouble, raised his hand. "Can I ask something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The equipment storage building." The confrontation. "When you were in handcuffs." He looked at her steadily. "Were you scared?" The room waited. Avery looked at him for a moment. She thought about the answer, not because she did not know it, but because she wanted to give him the true version, rather than the version that sounded good. "No," she said, "not in that room." "When were you scared?" She held that question. She looked at the 12 people watching her and decided that the true answer was the only one worth giving. "When I thought the evidence was going to disappear before it could matter," she said. "When the archive session was killed at 63%. When I thought the only record we had of what really happened to Daniel Foster was going to be erased by someone with enough system access to make it look like it had never existed." She paused. "That was the moment I was scared. Not because of 3 men in a room, because of the possibility that the truth would be there and then not be there, and Daniel Foster would spend the rest of recorded history blamed for his own death." The young investigator nodded slowly. "That's what we're protecting," she said. "Not the institution. The truth, in a form that cannot be erased. That is always the thing we are protecting." The class ran for 14 weeks. By the end of it, Avery could identify which of the 12 were going to be exceptional and which were going to need more times, which were ready to be placed in facilities where the kind of work she had done at Coronado was still necessary and still ongoing. The expanded investigation, which the Inspector General's office had named as a separate proceeding from the Coronado case, moved through its first phase in the spring. 2 additional sets of charges, 3 more commanders with financial connections to the contractor network. The 2 fatalities at the second facility, the names turned out to be Specialist Ramon Aguirre and Petty Officer Second Class Keisha Marshall, received the same official correction to their records that Daniel Foster had received. Their families received the same formal apology. Avery was not there for those ceremonies either. She did not attend ceremonies. People said her name in contexts that were designed to make her the center of the story. The center of the story was always the person who had seen something wrong and said so. The center of the story was always Daniel and Ramon and Keisha. She was the mechanism. Mechanisms should work and then step back. Shaw called her one evening in April. She was in her office going through candidate files for the second training cohort. "Trent Maddox started his sentence today," Shaw said. Avery set down the file she was holding. "Mercer is appealing the negligent homicide enhancement," Shaw said. "His attorney filed this morning. It's a long shot, but it's not nothing." "Holt will hold it," Avery said. "Holt will hold it," Shaw agreed. She paused. "How are you doing?" It was a question Shaw asked with a specific directness that most people in this kind of work did not ask each other. There was an unspoken norm in federal investigative work against asking how people were doing in ways that invited real answers, because real answers took time, and time was always the thing in shortest supply. Shaw had decided several years ago that the norm was wrong and had stopped following it. "I'm working," Avery said. "That's not what I asked." Avery was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stack of candidate files on her desk. She thought about the 12 people who had come through the first cohort and were now placed in facilities where the work was real, and the resistance was real, and the cost of doing it right was as real as it had always been. "I think about Daniel," she said, "not every day, but regularly. I think about the 4 words, and I think about the fact that the expanded investigation has now identified 7 facilities and 4 confirmed fatalities connected to the same contractor network." She paused. "I think about how many facilities we haven't looked at yet." "We're looking," Shaw said. "I know," Avery said. "I know we're looking." A pause. "He mattered," Shaw said. "His 4 words mattered." "You know that." "I know that," Avery said. "Say it like you believe it." Avery almost smiled. It was a small, almost smile, the specific kind that arrives when someone knows you well enough to call you on your own evasions. "He mattered," she said. "His 4 words changed things. Not everything. Not as much as they deserve to. But real things, in real facilities, for real people who are alive right now, because the investigation that started with his message found equipment that should not have been in service." She looked at her desk. "That's real. I believe that." "Good," Shaw said. "Don't stop." She hung up. Avery sat in her office for a few minutes after the call ended. The building was quiet at this hour. Most of the staff had gone home. She could hear, from somewhere down the corridor, the sound of one of her investigators still at their desk keyboard clicks, the occasional sound of a file being moved. Someone working late because the work required it and they had chosen to do the work that required it. She thought about what she would say to Daniel Foster if she could. She had thought about this before, occasionally, in the private moments that investigative work produces between its demands. She had never landed on a satisfying version of it because the things she wanted to say felt too large for the format of a conversation that was never going to happen. But she thought about it one more time tonight, sitting alone in her office, with the candidate files on her desk and the sound of a keyboard down the corridor. She thought, you were 23 years old and you understood something that people twice your age spend their careers avoiding understanding. That the cost of silence is always paid by someone, and the question is only whether that someone is you or whether it is a person you will never meet who had the bad luck to come after you. She thought, you chose to pay it yourself. And because you paid it, the people who came after you, the 14 submissions in Bennett's first month, the 12 candidates in her first cohort, the names she did not yet know in the facilities the investigation had not yet reached, had a system that was trying imperfectly and slowly, and with all the friction that real change always carries, to be worth the cost you paid. She thought, it is not enough. It is never going to be enough. But it is real, and it is permanent, and it is yours. 6 months later, Avery returned to the Coronado Annex for the first time since the arrests. Bennett had asked her to speak to the new class, not about the investigation, not about the arrests, but about what the training program was trying to become and why it mattered that it become that thing. She drove through the main gate in the early morning and parked and walked to the training ground. The new class was finishing a water rescue drill in the main pool. She stood at the edge of the pool deck and watched. In the middle of the sequence, one candidate surfaced and called for a stop. He had noticed a fraying strap on his training harness. He held it up and said, clearly and without hesitation, this needs to be replaced before we continue. The instructor looked at it. He said, good catch. Out of the water, everyone. We'll get a replacement. Nobody argued. Nobody mocked the candidate. Nobody suggested that the strap was close enough to fine or that stopping was a sign of weakness. The class climbed out of the pool, the equipment was replaced, and 6 minutes later, the drill resumed. 6 minutes, one candidate, one strap, one person who saw something wrong and said so in front of everyone and was right to. Avery watched it from the pool deck and felt something settle in her chest that was quiet and complete and did not need a name. Bennett appeared beside her. He had seen her arrive. He stood with her for a moment and watched the drill resume. 14 more submissions last month, he said. The confidential system. Any serious concerns, too. Both addressed. One equipment issue. One instructor conduct complaint that turned out to be legitimate and is being handled through proper channels. He paused. The instructor in question came to me voluntarily after the complaint was filed. He said he knew his approach had crossed a line, and he wanted to address it before the process required him to. Avery looked at the pool. He came voluntarily, she said. He came voluntarily, Bennett confirmed. That's a different culture than the one that existed here a year ago. It was. She could feel it in the way the pool deck sounded, the specific quality of a space where people were operating without the low-level tension that pervades environments where saying the wrong thing carries consequences that the people in authority will not acknowledge, but everyone understands. It was not perfect. It was going to need to be maintained and watched and corrected when it drifted, because all institutional cultures drift without deliberate effort, and the effort required was not the kind that ends. It was the daily kind. The ordinary, unglamorous, consistent kind that does not produce ceremonies or plaques or federal verdicts. It produces a candidate noticing a fraying strap and calling a stop. It produces a class that climbs out of the pool without argument. It produces an instructor who comes voluntarily before the process requires him to. That was what Daniel Foster's truth had changed. Not everything, not permanently, without effort, but this, today, in this facility. In a way that was real, and that was going to require people to keep choosing it every morning, the same way Daniel Foster had chosen it on the morning he sent 4 words to his sister and trusted that they would eventually go somewhere. Avery walked to the plaque outside Bennett's office before she left. She had not seen it in person before. She stood in front of it and read the words. Standards mean nothing if truth can be changed. Daniel Foster had been 19 when he wrote that. He had written it in a letter to a friend before he ever knew about R-441 Foxtrot, before he ever knew about Commander Mercer, before he ever found himself in a facility where the standards had been rewritten by the people responsible for maintaining them. He had already known what mattered. He had known it at 19, and he had known it at 23, and he had known it in the moment he pressed send on 4 words to his sister and accepted whatever came next. She stood in front of the plaque for 60 seconds. Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove toward the next facility on the list. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time, and maybe not completely, because systems built over years do not become clean in months. And the places where they are still broken are where the people who cannot afford to wait for them to fix themselves are standing right now. But the truth was moving. Daniel Foster had sent it moving, with 4 words and the specific courage of a person who tells the truth, not because they are certain it will change things, but because they cannot imagine being the kind of person who does not. That courage had a name. That name was on a plaque. And the work it had started was never going to stop.